Conference. We've listened to so many wonderful speakers, and today we've got 3 excellent speakers for you to listen to and interact with, which will be really fantastic. So welcome to panel 22, which is Families, Generational Shifts and Memories. My name is Elizabeth Triarico. I'm the manager of the Italian Historical Society in Melbourne, and I'm here to moderate and assist in any way I can. So our very first speaker is Alessio Baldini. Alessio will be presenting in Italian today, and Alessio is a lecturer in Italian culture at the University of Leeds. His main research interests revolve around family sagas and the ways in which they represent and shape Italy's moral imaginaries. Baldini has published exclusively on Italian family sagas and on authors such as Giovanni Verga, Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, and Natalia Ginsberg. Alessio's interest in family sagas and his translational experience has recently developed into a research interest in the history and identity of British Italians and its literary and cultural representation. So thank you for being here, Alessio. And Alessio's presentation is British Italians, Dandelions by Thea Leonarduzzi 2022 and the UK's Invisible Minority. Thank you.
Ok, grazie per essere qui. Mi devo scusare perché il titolo che avevo mandato, lo spelling del cognome di Leonarduzzi era sbagliato, questo è quello corretto. E la seconda cosa, mi è stato chiesto di parlare in italiano, che faccio molto volentieri. Le mie slide sono in inglese, quindi praticamente mi faccio il sottotitolaggio, quindi mi scuso se è un po'... non so come verrà, ci provo, ok? La cosa principale, se penso a questa conferenza, ovviamente ci sono tante diaspore italiane, ma si possono pensare 2 famiglie di diaspore. La diaspora storica, diciamo degli italiani etnici, italiane e italiane etniche, di cui tanto si parla in questa conferenza, e poi una nuova diaspora, che è la diaspora in arrivo da altri paesi. E ci ho pensato, insomma, durante la conferenza, che ho trovato molto bella. Quello che vorrei fare è cercare di tenere insieme un po' le storie di queste 2 diaspore, cercare di combinare la storia della diaspora storica e questa di queste diaspore nuove. E il caso del Regno Unito è un caso molto particolare per tante ragioni che cercherò di spiegare. Io sono partito da il libro di d'amore che abbiamo sentito nella prima giornata, che è veramente un libro molto importante, ed è il primo libro sulla letteratura della diaspora italo-britannica. Quello che è interessante, e che lei dice, è che è una letteratura che sta emergendo, non è sicuro che esista. Ma non è soltanto che non siamo sicure che esista questa letteratura, non siamo neanche sicure che esista l'identità sociale italo-britannica. Ci sono gli italo-americani, le italo-americane, lo stesso in Australia, Sudafrica. Sono tutte identità che hanno un nome, hanno un'identità, esistono, sono riconosciute pubblicamente anche dagli stati. Non è il caso degli italo-britannici e delle italo-britanniche. E quindi la mia domanda è, esiste, possiamo parlare di un'identità italo-britannica? Esiste una letteratura italo-britannica? Questa è la mia domanda fondamentale. La cosa interessante, questo memoir di Leonarduzzi è il primo ad aver avuto un'ampia copertura sui media nazionali britannici. È stato recensito dal Financial Times, è stato recensito da The Guardian e dal Times Literary Supplement. Però quello che è interessante è che la recensione del Financial Times, che è quella più lunga e quella più seria, non parla proprio di italo-britannici. La cosa interessante è che il memoir viene letto come un memoir transnazionale che ha un effetto antinazionalista, cioè un effetto contro l'identità. E quindi è interessante che, se ci pensate, quello che manca proprio nella recensione del Financial Times e vi dà un senso di questo fatto fondamentale è proprio manca il concetto di italo-britannico, e se manca il concetto manca anche la realtà sociale, secondo me. La presentazione è fatta di 3 parti, ci saranno tante cose sulle slide, non le leggerò tutte, ci sono tanti dati, ci sono tanti concetti, quindi non vi preoccupate, non è che dovete leggere tutto e non andrò su tutto. Però volevo darvi un'idea un po' completa. E la presentazione è in 3 parti, quindi volevo parlare di che cosa sono gli italo-britannici, quindi partiamo con dei dati fondamentalmente dell'AIRE e del Home Office e anche i dati raccolti dalla Fondazione Migrantes. Quindi la prima parte sarà di fatto di sociologia e antropologia della migrazione e poi mi faccio la domanda e vorrei con voi esplorare questa questione. Questa conferenza appunto ha 2 termini nel titolo, è identità e rappresentazione. Mi voglio chiedere qual è il rapporto, che cos'è l'identità e qual è il rapporto con le arti. Questa è la mia domanda fondamentale. E poi questo case study, dico qualcosa su questo memoir, ok? Va bene questo piano? Spero che sia abbastanza chiaro. Partiamo un po' con alcuni dati. La comunità italo-britannica è una comunità super diversa e questo è un termine tecnico che viene dall'antropologia della migrazione. Cercherò di spiegare cosa vuol dire e come mai è, a mia conoscenza, è l'unica comunità diasporica italiana che è super diversa. Ora, alcuni dati in generale. Nel 2024 c'erano 6,1 milioni di cittadini italiani, o il 9,3% del totale di cittadini italiani, che erano registrati con l'AIRE come residenti all'estero. Questo ovviamente non include tutta la comunità diasporica, che è più larga, perché questi sono quelli che hanno la cittadinanza italiana, che quindi si possono iscrivere all'AIRE. Ma la comunità diasporica italiana nel mondo è più grande, perché ci sono membri della comunità diasporica che non hanno la cittadinanza e quindi non sono iscritti all'ARE, oppure che hanno la cittadinanza ma non si iscrivono all'ARE. Quindi questa è la cifra minima. Okay? L'Italia nel 2024 aveva 88,9 milioni di cittadini residenti. Okay? Questo esclude ovviamente i non cittadini residenti. Vedete che è una cosa abbastanza grande, il 9,3% del totale della cittadinanza italiana vive all'estero. Quindi stiamo parlando di una realtà molto importante. La comunità diasporica nel Regno Unito è grande. Secondo i dati raccolti nel 2024, al 1 gennaio del 2024, secondo dati raccolti dalla Fondazione Migrantes, la Fondazione Migrantes, che è della CEI, della Conferenza Episcopale Italiana, fondamentalmente raccoglie i dati dell'AIRE. Le statistiche che producono sono basate su dati dell'AIRE. Secondo loro, la comunità diasporica britannica, italo-britannica, era il 7,8% del totale, cioè la sesta più grande. Vi ricordo che è una definizione tecnica di nuovo, questa non è tutta la diaspora italiana, noi stiamo parlando di persone che hanno la cittadinanza e che si registrano all'AIRE, okay? Però sono gli unici dati attendibili che abbiamo, quindi come si fa in sociologia e in antropologia bisogna andare con i dati che abbiamo, ma essere consapevoli dei limiti dei dati, okay? In questo caso noi sappiamo che questi dati sono delle sottostime, questo è definitorio, è soltanto definitorio. Abbiamo dei dati dell'Home Office. Allora, nel Regno Unito non si raccolgono dati demografici su base etnica, ma non si raccolgono dati demografici sugli italo-britannici. Se voi andate sul sito dell'Home Office, se siete bianche o bianche, se vi autoidentificate come bianche, persone bianche, avete other. C'è Irish, ci sono un'altra serie di categorie, ma c'è other. Quindi lo Stato britannico non è interessato a raccogliere questi dati. La domanda interessante è perché. Però ci sono dei dati interessanti che noi possiamo usare e sono quelli, dopo Brexit, c'è stato un accordo e il cosiddetto, la possibilità di fare domanda per EU Settlement Scheme, che dava il diritto di residenza permanente. Secondo i dati dell'Home Office, se si mettono insieme i dati dell'Home Office del 2023, a 2023 le italiane e gli italiani, cioè cittadini italiani e italiane, erano il terzo gruppo più largo, dopo i rumeni e i polacchi. Quindi stiamo parlando di una minoranza significativa nel contesto del Regno Unito post-Brexit. Vi ricordo che, di nuovo, ricordate, la diaspora italiana è ancora più grande perché ovviamente non tutte le persone hanno la cittadinanza italiana e non quella britannica. Gli italo-britannici che erano storici, quelli che erano arrivati lì negli anni 50, 60, eccetera, avevano già la cittadinanza britannica, non hanno fatto domanda per EU Settlement Scheme, quindi stiamo parlando di una popolazione ancora più grande. Queste sono sottostime, quello che vi dico io è il minimo, questo è il minimo dei numeri che noi abbiamo. Ora, se si mettono insieme questi dati con i dati raccolti dai comites, che sono i comitati degli italiani all'estero, i dati dell'ARE, si può fare una stima che la comunità italo-britannica è lo 0,7% della popolazione residente nel Regno Unito e sono circa 525.000 persone. È tanto. Dal punto di vista demografico questo è un dato significativo. La domanda è, per una minoranza così significativa è interessante che non ci sia un concetto perché loro possono essere riconosciute e si possano riconoscere in un'identità? E questa è la mia domanda. Ora, vi ho parlato un po', vi ho dato un po' una mappatura molto breve, ma per me fondamentale, di dati. Vi ricordate, parlavo del fatto che c'è una cosa molto particolare della comunità italo-britannica nel Regno Unito, ed è super diversa, è l'unica nel mondo, che per quanto io ne sappia, per le cose che ho letto di sociologia e antropologia della migrazione. Ora, per cosa vuol dire super diverso e come mai questa comunità è super diversa? Allora, super diversa è un concetto che viene dalla sociologia e dall'antropologia della migrazione ed è stato Vertwe, che è un antropologo che lavora a Oxford e ha coniato questo concetto. Ora, qual era l'idea di Vertwe? Certo, un paese multietnico, multireligioso, razziale come il Regno Unito è diverso, ha della diversità e queste comunità sono diverse, nel senso che sono diverse dalla maggioranza, sono minoranze, sono altre. Però dice lui, ok, l'Home Office e la cultura britannica ha pensato a queste minoranze come omogenee all'interno, per esempio i britannici neri, i britannici di origine caraibica, i britannici di origine indiana. Tutte le politiche della migrazione, dell'integrazione, ma anche la cultura britannica ha pensato a queste comunità come internamente omogenee. Questo non è vero. Le lingue parlate da queste comunità, le tradizioni culturali, religiose, le appartenenze di classe sociale, il potere che possono avere, il genere sessuale, sono tutte diverse, sono super diverse, vuol dire che sono diverse al loro interno. E questo è fondamentale quando si costruiscono politiche di integrazione, di multiculturalismo, ma per noi, per me che faccio ricerca, questo è fondamentale quando si cerca di capire l'identità sociale. Le identità sociali sono super diverse, sono diverse al loro interno, non esiste questa omogeneità, non esiste nei dati. Il caso degli italo-britannici è molto interessante. Questa comunità è diventata recentemente super diversa, non lo era prima nella misura in cui lo è adesso, per un fenomeno molto semplice, che gli antropologi e sociologi della migrazione chiamano migrazione secondaria, in inglese si chiama onward migration. Questa migrazione secondaria avviene un po' in tutti i posti, ma avviene in particolare dentro la zona Schengen, cioè la zona un po' più grande dell'Unione Europea dove c'è il libero movimento delle persone, come parte del pacchetto di diritti del mercato unico. Ora, la cosa interessante che vi mostrano i sociologi e le sociologhe che hanno lavorato su questi dati, vedete dei nomi con fra parentesi con i numeri, quelli sono, diciamo, le fonti secondarie che uso o primarie. Io ovviamente non vi dico nulla di questo perché non è la cosa centrale, però alla fine c'è una bibliografia, vedete tutti i paper da cui ho preso questi dati. Ora, cosa succede? Pensate al caso faccio un esempio comune. C'è una grandissima comunità di italo-bengalesi in Italia, persone arrivate dal Bangladesh che iniziano ad arrivare negli anni 90 in grandi numeri, lavorano, acquisiscono la cittadinanza e iniziano ad avere famiglie, figlie e figli che nascono qui. Ora sapete che la legge della cittadinanza italiana è una legge che non è adatta all'Italia contemporanea. Non farò commenti politici, ma questo è solo un fatto. Questa è una legge che cattura movimenti migratori dell'Ottocento e del Novecento, soprattutto in uscita. Questa legge non funziona più, questo è chiaro. La maggior parte degli stranieri e delle straniere residenti in Italia senza cittadinanza sono bambine e bambini italiani nati qua. E questo è un fatto e non è un'affermazione politica. quando queste persone nascono in Italia, a un certo punto crescono e questi genitori, per tutta una serie di ragioni, ricominciano a migrare. Una volta che hanno avuto la cittadinanza italiana, per gli accordi di Schengen possono andare in qualunque paese europeo e questa è la migrazione secondaria. Questo ovviamente cambia con Brexit, okay, per il Regno Unito, però i dati che abbiamo ora raccontano, come spesso i dati sociologici, raccontano un percorso del passato recente, non quello attuale. E quindi queste persone arrivano in Italia e sono italo-bengalesi, italo-ghanesi, italo-indiani, eccetera. E secondo le stime raccolte dai comites, insieme a quelle dell'ARE, nel 2021 il 26,1% delle italiane e degli italiani, cittadine e cittadini registrati nel Regno Unito, erano nati in un paese terzo, terzo dall'Italia e terzo dal Regno Unito. Questo vuol dire che gli italo-bengalesi, eccetera, sono ancora più grandi, sono probabilmente un terzo, perché pensate che alcune di queste figlie e figli sono nati in Italia e non sono catturati da questi dati. Quindi immaginate, un terzo della popolazione italo-britannica italiana non è etnicamente italiana in modo puro, ma ha altre discendenze. La cosa che mi interessa è che proprio questa cosa di super diversità, come dicevo, queste identità sono multidimensionali, cioè ci sono tanti aspetti, c'è l'aspetto della classe sociale, l'aspetto del genere, l'aspetto delle lingue usate, eccetera. E poi queste identità si intersecano, cioè una cosa è essere per esempio una donna italo-marocchina musulmana di classe popolare nel Regno Unito, una cosa è essere un uomo bianco avvocato che vive a Londra, sono due modi di essere italiani molto diversi e quello che l'idea di superdiversità cerca di catturare è questa idea qui. Ok, ha avuto senso un po'? Ok, questa è la comunità italo-britannica oggi, quindi è una comunità super diversa, ma in modo significativo. Beh, potete chiedere, ok, questo è interessante, ma io studio narrazioni, io studio arte, qual è l'idea? Qual è l'idea di fondo? Allora, quando si parla di identità in questi contesti, si parla fondamentalmente di una cosa un po' tecnica che si chiama identità sociale, ok? Io prendo una particolare teoria dell'identità sociale. L'identità sociale è una cosa alla fine molto semplice. È una cosa che serve per classificare le persone. La persona è bianca, è nera, è italiana, tedesca, eccetera. Queste persone che assorbono questa identità per se stesse, la usano per integrarsi nel mondo, si autorappresentano, si autoidentificano come italiane, come bianche, come donne, eccetera, eccetera. Questi sono processi sociali. E poi queste persone vengono trattate dalle persone altre, sia della stessa identità che di identità diverse, in un certo modo. Se volete un po' l'idea degli stereotipi, quando noi ci avviciniamo a una persona, quando una persona mi avvicina e scopre che sono italiano, ha tutta una serie di idee rispetto a chi sono io. La cosa importante delle identità sociali, le identità sociali si possono contestare dall'esterno e anche dall'interno, non sono deterministiche. Le persone possono essere, per esempio, italiane o italo-britanniche, possono decidere di non esserlo e se lo sono possono decidere come esserlo e saranno anche tante altre cose. Quindi l'identità è sia personale, ogni persona ha un'identità sociale o più, e è relazionale, ci mette in relazione con le altre persone. E appunto queste identità sociali hanno un impatto sulle persone che è differenziato a seconda del pacchetto di identità che di cui queste persone sono portatrici e queste identità si intersecano. La cosa che vi voglio far vedere, questo è sul rapporto questo è uno schema dell'identità sociale che ho preso da una filosofa americana che si chiama Sally Haslanger, che ha lavorato su questo. E vedete che le identità sociali sono fatte di comportamento, ruoli, norme, e quello che interessa a me in particolare è quello che lei chiama il simbolismo. Cioè, noi abbiamo delle risorse, cioè la cultura fondamentalmente, delle storie attraverso la letteratura, attraverso il cinema, attraverso la televisione, che vengono usate appunto per esprimere identità, per rappresentare identità, ma anche per contestarla, per immaginarla, per inventarla e per decostruirla. E questo è il rapporto fra le identità sociali e le arti. Le arti fanno parte delle risorse simboliche che le persone collettivamente e individualmente usano per entrare in relazione e esprimere la propria identità, incluso contestarla, ovviamente. E questo è quello che fa Leonarduzzi in questo memoir. E chiudo con, insomma, con una breve, vado bene col tempo, con una breve analisi di questo romanzo, questo memoir, ve lo presento. Okay? Ora, il libro di D'Amore è fondamentale, l'ho già citato all'inizio, ero molto felice di andare al panel dove lei era. Lei fa questo campionario di letteratura italo-britannica, sono circa 30 opere letterarie dal 1938 al 2020. Ora, guardando quel corpus, vi posso dire che nessuna di quelle persone è una scrittrice professionista. E questo è importante per le arti, perché le arti sono delle istituzioni sociali e il riconoscimento che ricevono è un riconoscimento normativo in qualche modo. Leonarduzzi, il Dandelions di Leonarduzzi è la prima opera d'arte di una italo-britannica che è artisticamente ambiziosa. Cioè si presenta come un'opera d'arte seria, non vuole solo raccontare la sua storia familiare, vuole fare un'opera d'arte. Questo è importante, se volete poi ne parliamo di cosa vuol dire artisticamente ambizioso, ma è un po' questa, la cosa fondamentale è questa. Questa persona non vuole solo raccontare la sua storia, vuole fare un'opera d'arte, come Dante, come Petrarca, come Gadda, non lo so, come Manzoni, questo è il tipo di ambizione. E infatti ve lo dice lei stessa. Prima di tutto lavora per il Times Literary Supplement, che è fondamentalmente una delle riviste più importanti della cultura nel Regno Unito. Il libro è stato pubblicato da Fitzcarraldo Editions, che è highbrow, è una casa editrice piccola, ma che fa circolare opere d'arte ambiziose. E la stessa Leonarduzzi vi dichiara l'intenzione, perché nelle prime pagine lei richiama quello che è di fatto, secondo me, ma insomma non è controverso, credo, il memoir familiare più importante della cultura italiana, che è Lessico familiare di Natalia Ginzburg, che è uscito nel 1963 e che fu definito all'epoca l'autobiografia della nazione. Quindi Leonarduzzi, richiamandosi a quell'opera, non fa soltanto un gesto per dire ok, questo è il genere letterario a cui mi ispiro, ma sta dicendo io vi racconto una storia che è ambiziosa come questa sul piano artistico e sul piano potenziale del significato culturale storico. Lei è molto consapevole di questo che fa. E poi se guardate il testo stesso, è un testo incredibilmente complesso. Anzitutto Leonarduzzi ha un controllo totale della prosa in inglese. È una prosa con un estremo controllo stilistico, lessicale, i temi che affronta sono temi fondamentalmente filosofici e di storia culturale. Ovviamente, essendo un editor del Times Literary Supplement, è una persona molto colta che ha letto di tutto e lo vede e non risparmia citazioni, discussioni complesse. Non è un libro per le persone che non si interessano di cultura, perché ci si perde, perché non racconta solo la sua storia familiare, ma vi racconta cose molto complicate della storia italiana, della storia britannica e di temi veramente filosofici. E poi anche la struttura narrativa è molto complicata, ci vuole un po' per riuscire a orientarsi nel labirinto del modo in cui lei racconta la storia della sua famiglia, che non è un racconto cronologico, lei va avanti e indietro nel tempo. Ora, che cos'è questa storia? Ci siamo? Beh, spero che tutto bene. Ora, vi ho fatto una piccola mappa. Allora, questa storia è una storia di una famiglia italo-britannica su 4 generazioni. È una famiglia transnazionale che si muove 2 volte, o se no 3 o 4, dipende come si conta, fra Magnago, che è nel Friuli Venezia Giulia, quindi nord-est dell'Italia, e fondamentalmente Manchester, poi c'è anche una parte a Sheffield e a Londra. E quindi si muove avanti e indietro così. La storia è tutta raccontata dal punto di vista dell'autrice, che scrive in prima persona con la sua voce, quindi è un memoir, non è una finzione, esattamente come Natalia Ginzburg, il lessico familiare. Ed è basato in qualche modo sulle registrazioni delle conversazioni che ha avuto con la nonna Dirce, che in quel momento era in Italia, era tornata in Italia molto tempo prima. Nonna Dirce era nata nel 1926 ed era tornata in Italia negli anni 70, dopo aver vissuto 2 volte nel Regno Unito. Nonna dice, appunto, vive in Regno Unito fra il 35 e il 36 e fra il 50 e il 71. Questa è la genealogia familiare, vedete com'è complesso. La cosa interessante che vi voglio dire, e la cosa più importante, Leonarduzzi sceglie di parlare della famiglia paterna, che è la famiglia italiana. Quindi racconta la storia a partire dalle interviste con la nonna paterna. Non vi parla mai della famiglia inglese, della madre, che rimane senza nome, e di tutta la genealogia familiare. Si sa che vengono da Liverpool, questa è l'unica cosa che si sa, e questo è interessante. La cosa che fa che è interessante è... L'inizio è molto bello, secondo me, vi racconta bene la storia della nonna, che è una donna di classe popolare, e inizia così, vi leggo solo la prima frase. A woman with a soft brow Pam walks slowly through tall grasses between the Co-op distribution center and an abandoned warehouse. She's from Magnago, the small Italian town where she was born. Her dress, a simple straight skirted, below the knee affair, muted green polyester with perhaps some swirling pattern in pale yellow, almost blends into the surroundings. You wouldn't spot her but for the occasional glint of a faux gold button on her calf and the electric pink and blue of her half apron, with its deep pockets designed to contain the multitudes of needles, threads, timbals, and safety pins that are the seamstress's tools. She stops at regular intervals and bends over, almost double, to pinch her fingers around clumps of leaves and delicately, decisively pluck. As she strengthens, she pushes handfuls of greens into a bag before continuing on her own way. The woman is my grandmother, mia nonna, sometimes with my father beside her, tugging awkwardly at the shorts she made him, and she's picking dandelions to go with the evening meal. She hops and waves between the flowers' perky heads, dotted like asterisks on a densely annotated page. Questa è una donna di classe popolare, working class. La cosa interessante è che Leonarduzzi non è in grado di raccontare la sua storia, si vede già da qui. Tutta questa storia di povertà e di difficoltà a lei sembra come la pagina di un libro, perché questa è una persona colta. E nonostante questa apertura, quello che sentite non è davvero mai l'esperienza di Dirce, è sempre l'esperienza dell'autrice, cioè di una persona colta che cerca di filtrare questa storia familiare popolare per nobilitarla. Ed è quello che fa con proprio l'idea di Dandelions. Dandelions, questa persona prendeva di fatto delle piante che crescono su una strada inquinata accanto a un magazzino a Manchester, nel centro di Manchester. E questo diventano per l'autrice dei simboli della cultura alta. Quindi spende pagine e pagine per spiegarvi che i Dandelions nella cristianità medievale erano praticamente, avevano tutti dei significati simbolici, ok? Ed è proprio questo che invece per la nonna è l'esperienza di free food. La nonna non ha queste connotazioni, non ha questo che lei pensa. Ok? Quindi la cosa, per concludere, la cosa che volevo dire, la cosa interessante, se leggete questo libro in questo contesto degli italo-britannici, il libro secondo me ha due problemi. Un problema interno, non è veramente in grado di rendere l'esperienza della nonna, che è di classe popolare, e la seconda cosa è un libro che è uscito nel 2022, ignora completamente la realtà demografica degli italo-britannici, cioè si racconta come se gli italo-britannici di discendenza inglese etnica, italiana etnica, fossero l'unica realtà di cui si racconta. E quindi, insomma, è interessante, è un bel libro, è importante, ma ha un po' questo... C'è molto di più nella realtà che c'è nel libro che vi ho presentato. Grazie.
Grazie mille Alessio, è stato molto interessante a capire il fatto che in Britannia c'è questo fatto che gli italiani non sono conosciuti nella scrittura. Questa cosa non lo sapevo prima di oggi, e capire veramente cosa vuol dire identità, la complessità di questo. Grazie mille. We will be having questions at the end of the session, so you're most welcome to ask the questions then. Thank you. Now, on our behalf, I'd like to welcome Kimberly to present her paper. With family origins in Volturrara, Apulia, Foggia, and Castigliana Grotte Bari, Kimberly Campanello was born in Elkhart, Indiana, and has lived in Ireland and the UK since 2010. Padraig Ó Tuama describes her work as a confrontation, a lamentation, a powerful objection, and a revolution. New poems and prose appear in Tolka Grante 2023 Most Read Poem, and some such stories. Much of her work addresses vulnerability and care, including her experience of young onset Parkinson's disease, 2021, age 41. Her next poetry collection, An Interesting Detail, is forthcoming with Bloomsbury, trade in 2025. That's wonderful. Congratulations. She's Professor of Poetry at the University of Leeds, and Kimberly today will be talking about We Are All Bells Ringing, Crafting a Mobile Italian Diasporic Memoir. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. So, as I was saying to my colleague Alessio, we decided to come together. And if you told me a year ago that I'd be in Genoa talking about my Italian-American family background and sharing work that I'd written quite rapidly, having learned Italian about a year ago, I'd be like, no, that's not going to happen. Sounds nice, though. I bet the food was good. But I wouldn't have believed it. So essentially, I'm going to sort of do a bit of a reading of that material because I thought, well, why not just get it from the horse's mouth? And then I'll try to talk a little bit about it in that way. I emerged into the cliche. Italian, American, Midwest. Our restaurant, founded by my grandfather, son of immigrants, 1957. Now run by my father, still. Pizza, money, cars, yards, refrigerators, ice cream bars, wads of cash stuffed into the hands of children, then young adults, leaving on trips or not. Money into the hands of the now old sons and daughters of the immigrants. Money into my hands, into my cousin's hands, stuffing us and slapping us to love. The immigrant herself, her hand flat on our cheeks, special rapid taps, her stockings falling down. Her brother, the first in the ground. What was he into that put him there? Am I the first one to write out his name since? John, Giovanni, Finamore. Shot, 1914. Are you the first to read it in a long, long time? We stepped over his grave when we buried ourselves in the Catholic cemetery. All of us dead so far. The letter his sister Teresina, an immigrant, dictated to a woman in our Midwest town who could read and write. 1978. The letter carried across the water and up the mountain by my blue-jeaned parents. The letter read out in the village square on the mountaintop to the friend Antoinetta, who Teresina left behind. We don't know what the letter said. The driver who read the letter out in the square on the mountaintop wept. My blue-jeaned parents wept. We all tell the story and weep. The woman, Antoinetta, wept as she looked at my father and said Teresina's, his grandmother's, name again and again. Teresina, Teresina, a name, a refrain. Yesterday, I told the story of the letter read out in the square. In this place, another village, another square, in another cafe, in the same region of this country as that mountaintop village. I can say it here before the proper nouns rightly disappear. This place is Puglia, Italy, not Britain, where I live now, where Constantine himself was crowned. Puglia, with its Virgin Marys of health and women named Health. Even still, the people get sick and die. I didn't know the meaning of health until I got the name Parkinson attached to mine. I know what health is now because I am moving away from it all the time. Teresina, Teresina. You see how proper nouns, if too recent or too clear, turn away from refrain? Why throw these ropes to the shore? What is hoped will happen? How can they be tied? What do they secure? I must get this journey down before this round of medication stops working. And I must take more. And then I worsen. Change again. Take more. Until. Before you say that the soul is the real me and that everything is fine, remember that prepositions are the most difficult thing we learn when we learn a language, and still we don't get them right. The I is somewhere with or in or around the brain and the body, or through it, or shot through it. This may or may not be all there is, but it certainly feels that way when you are ill. Until perhaps you dream, or have a vision, or speak another language, whether awake or asleep, or when you write. Then I becomes us. So that's the opening of the novel. And so it kind of, I think as my colleague was saying, it is doing some of the things that were discussed, in the sense I'm trying to work through, I suppose, what I take to be, what can we take from, or what could I take from this background of mine that I never actually written about many things. And I think when I became ill, it became crucial to work out, as I say in the novel, what are the key ingredients about which there are truths amongst all of this? And that meant actually being honest about where things come from and what they are. And in order to do that, in the opening continues and it breaks down the idea of the cliche. So the printer's phrase, when type was invented, that becomes a set phrase. And it compares those to the cathedral in Voltarapola, a 12th century cathedral that has squares on it, and that's the only kind of decoration of the whole thing. And it takes that idea, I think, of what Alessio was talking about identity, in order to question the idea that the cliche, the one-off version of the self, is static and can be reproduced endlessly. So what I do is I get rid of all the proper nouns, as you probably guessed, after we move on from there. And I use periphrasis. So Volturarapola becomes the heart in the pocket of peaks. Elkhart, Indiana becomes the town with the island that has the town with the island that is the heart of a long gone animal, because the name of Elkhart comes from the Potawatomi, who named it for that. So what I do through that, I hope, is I try to communicate directly, I suppose, to my family, and probably many families, about that experience of diaspora, but also the experience of sort of what we could take forward, I suppose. So I'm going to read a little bit of that type of writing, if I can find it. The Parkinson's makes your throat a bit iffy. So what I think is funny, because I spent my whole life performing poetry, and so now it always sounds like it's my first rodeo, like it's my first performance. But I think it's quite good, because it makes you feel a bit vulnerable, because the vulnerability is not that I'm nervous. The vulnerability is that I'm nervous, that you think I'm nervous. And, and actually, it's not that at all, because oh no, I've just lost, I put it there. So what it does is it makes you think about what you can say, and when you can say it, and for how long you can say it. And I think the distinction that Alessio makes about high art, low art, is an important one. We all have different aims for whatever we do. But I also think at the end of the day, you got to say it, whatever it is, and not worry about it. If there are errors, make revisions and insertions until you have the best version. Consider all we will make now. Fill the space between stone with substance so it will hold. Remember the dead. Birth language again and again. The wise young men of the village said their greatest song is added to always. New verses are made in the moment, always created in the moment itself. Moments of life in the heart, in the pocket of peaks. In the great encyclopedia of the dialect by the local historian, the encyclopedia of the language spoken in the village, the language spoken by Teresina, the language that rips the air, that tears words like hunks of bread. There is a section on names in that language, a list of all of them, their meanings, and after the final name, a fresh page lists all the names in other languages, names of those who have come to live in the village that is a heart in the pocket of peaks. It lists where the names and so the people are from. The local historian writes that he made this list because the village was nearly destroyed by people leaving. And people still leave from elsewhere, like always. And we must honor those who come. See the line of us as a whole string, rather than individual people, individual scenes as single beads, a line, a string to hold when speaking the mysteries of joy, of pain. Beads on a loop of thread held together in a pair of hands, rather than a single crystal of sand, refracting only slightly in the waning light. Everyone was everywhere at one time, and everyone was a small number then, and everyone is more now, with countless connections, endless black and white threads wrapped around our hearts. Our is vast. I is us. We sit over key ingredients at tables in squares and in houses, in pockets and in peaks. Forever and always, we tend our graves, we care for others, our words and laughter slip into the trees. The map that is a rag, mapin, mappa, that wipes blood from the birthmark on your knee. The rag on the bar, where Kay and the people speak, is the only map you will need. This is how we are related. Unfathomable links, an ancient labyrinth set out in tiny stones, black and white hair spread out in a utility sink. So now, writing this, gathering herself, Kay feels that familiar and vertiginous sense that no family, no person is truly special, truly central in any such thing as a grand story, and that this whole angle on existence, the central characters we must feel we are, as has been traced and retraced in stone, in lambskin, on dead trees, is a necessary, even wonderful joke on us all. This is how we know Giovanni's name, your name, any name, is pure sound, like the pure sound of the rag that was a map in the language that rips the air, tears words like a hunk of bread. In the dreamland, across the bridge from the island that is the heart of a long-gone animal, Kay spent all that time in early mornings with her father, making dough, making specialties. In the parking lot, the falling snow erased evidence of their arrival hours before. Then the time felt permanent, permanent like death, permanent like certain truths about key ingredients, permanent like signatures that transfer lands to keep the farm together, permanent like devastating near accidents you can hardly believe have not happened, permanent like memories of the storms that visited the dreamland town on the holy day and tore it asunder, permanent like the diseases that can't be cured, only treated, permanent like your life feels as it is rolling along. Permanent like pain, like we fear pain may be. Permanent like pain we have, pain we want to pass, that others only fear. Permanent like beauty, permanent like love. Permanent is how time felt there in the silence with her father and the bread. Permanent like laughter, changing the pressure in the air, like key ingredients about which there are truths. Permanence is still happening, as the tense just written here says. The language of permanence, permanence itself, is never fixed, always continuous, needs help and care. To be vulnerable is to be valuable. This is how we are related. So, it's very hard to do this mic thing, isn't it? I can't breathe. I need to go back. Can I just do that? So as you saw, I call myself, I use a kind of K, which is a wonderful thing that Kafka does as well. But it also happens to be, my name's Kimberly, so it's very handy. And so, you don't have to worry if you meet me, because this is all happening in real time. I'm writing all of these things in real time. If you meet me, as it says, you don't have to worry whether you encounter me in the streets or words or in the dreamland or anywhere at all. There won't be any sense of the you other than the trace of you before you would drift away. And I think one of the things that you probably noticed that I've done is try to link the thing that I'm struck by, to be honest, is the way that the diasporas are connected, but they're also connected to genocides. They're also connected to pain. And to me, pain is what we share. La ferita, the complex wounds that we have, are not something to be ashamed of. They're something that bind us together. They're the black and white threads of writing or of all the things that we've experienced together. And that to me is something that I'm trying to bring together in a way by keeping the proper nouns. The us and the them becomes less clear. And I think that if there was something that I took away from my childhood, it is that sense. And I wanted to remind my own family of that lesson that I learned from them. So I have to show a picture of the Beast Nona and me in my first communion outfit at a Diasporic Italian American conference, because otherwise it would seem like here's my chance, right? So you know, one of the things, just to talk a bit more technically, is that you know, this is all new to me because I had, and for reasons I now understand, you know, studied French in high school, majored in English. People had different dialects. I have certain words that I would hear and that are still used and are now used in Elkhart by people who are not Italian Americans who work at our restaurant. You know, so over generations, certain dialect words persist in quite a funny way. And of course, as you probably imagine, they're the dirty words. So one of the things that I've tried to do is to invoke some of that sense that dialect has, which often is to use figuration or use a metaphor for something, whether it's metonymy or, you know, whatever type of metaphor you want to use. And so that's the way I've talked about places, people, actions, ways of being. And I think, therefore, it's reminiscent of many of the experiences I now have, having gone to Volturno Apple and spending, you know, half my time there. And one of the things that also was an agenda, so Alessio very, very kindly said he doesn't have a political agenda. I suppose I don't have a political agenda, other than, you know, the ways in which certain kinds of political divisiveness ruins meals. To me, that's the worst peccato of all, is the way that, you know, the sources that we cannot trust with our hearts in their red pockets or with our graves, those sources end meals. And I think, you know, in American, you probably guess which sources I'm talking about. But I think ultimately it doesn't matter the source. And so I obviously then end up with Dante because I'm having to deal with the fact of a periphrasis for the Italian language. And so the language of the poet, but it's also the streets that link towns to squares and all of these things. So it's a very sort of historically accurate way, I suppose, but it's a coming at me through the process. And then for those of you, like, there's probably Beatles fans in the room, and then there's probably Beatles haters in the room. There always are, right? So for me, I had to talk about the Madonna, and so that became the woman who speaks, because she's speaking words of wisdom, but of course that's Paul McCartney actually writing about his own mother. And so throughout the whole novel, there's this woman who speaks, which of course is me, which of course is every M. And then I ultimately take the litany of Loretto and add in the idea that, you know, she's all of these, she's the refuge of this and that, but she's the woman who speaks. And I think, so it's a bit of a rewriting of a number of discourses and things in a technical way. But actually, at the end of the day, I think most poets and writers, if you've grown up Catholic and however you are today, you just actually wanted to do a mass, right? Get people to listen. So I think it has that quality as well. And so my translation of the Agnus Dei is to be vulnerable is to be valuable. And that's the sort of sense that I am trying to convey through the whole thing. So I'll leave it there because that's probably well enough for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was incredibly powerful, and I think it just shows the importance of the family, but also the emotion and feeling that's never really talked about in this way. So thank you so much for sharing. It's such a personal story. Thank you. Just one second.
Soltanto per ricordare che al termine del vostro panel e del dibattito che seguirà alle 11 vi aspettiamo in sala Colombo per il coffee break. Seguirà poi la tavola rotonda in auditorium. Grazie.
Grazie Nicola. Grazie. So we have our last speaker, now Emilia. Thanks, Emilia. Emilia Potenza is the curator of the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, where she has worked since its inception in 2001. In association with the Apartheid Museum, she has curated the permanent exhibitions of several other museums in South Africa, including the Nelson Mandela Museum in Matwa, the Steve Biko Centre in Ginsberg, the Nelson Mandela Capture Site Museum in KwaZulu-Natal, and the Desmond Tutu Museum in Cape Town. She has also curated many major temporary exhibitions related to Nelson Mandela and the transition from apartheid to democracy throughout the world. Throughout her career, she has been involved in anti-racist and progressive education. As a student and then a teacher, she was actively involved in opposing apartheid in the 1970s and 1980s, principally through building South Africa's first non-racial teachers' organisation. She has also written many groundbreaking history and English textbooks. Emilia is currently also a volunteer in a literacy project for Foundation Phase learners. Thank you, Emilia. And Emilia's presentation today is The Apple Falls Far from the Tree.
Well, it's very wonderful to be here. Thank you very much. I am going to be continuing with the conversation about family that we've started between the three of us today, and not just talking about my family, but to be telling you the story of my family in order to illustrate some important historical trends and to give a flavor of the immigrant Italian experience in South Africa. So the story of South Africa is the story of gold. The discovery of the largest gold reef in the world in what became Johannesburg in 1886 kick-started the process of industrialization in South Africa. Historians often make the point that it would not have been profitable to mine this gold if it had been found anywhere else in the world, because it is very deep level, 3 kilometers under the ground, in fact. And the ore is very low grade, so you have to mine a huge amount of ore to get a small amount of gold. But what made South Africa's case unique was how Africans were forced off the land into the mines to provide a ready supply of cheap black migrant labor. The mine owners, so this is what Johannesburg looked like in 1886 when gold was discovered. The mine owners were white colonizers who had the support of the white minority government, while the majority of unskilled workers were black with no political or economic rights. This set the scene for racial capital, segregation, and then apartheid in South Africa. Now, as we know, at a similar time in Italy, there were both waves of mass migration after unification from the impoverished agricultural south to the industrializing north. But we also see that one of the largest voluntary migrations in history, and we've been talking about this over the last 3 days. In the region of 10 million Italians leave Italy in search of a better life, mostly to the US, Argentina, Brazil, some to other European countries, including the UK, some to Australia, and a very small number to African countries, including South Africa. And Italians come to South Africa from other African countries, interestingly. So my family, the first generation Italians in South Africa from 1911 to 1939. The discovery of gold led to the development of the city of Johannesburg in South Africa. This is what Johannesburg looked like a mere 20 years later, and resulted in the need for artisans in the early 1900s. 2 of my maternal grandparents' brothers Gustavo and Orfeo Risi from Fisciano, Salerno were the first to make the grueling 42-day sea journey to South Africa in the early 1900s. My grandmother is pictured on the right. They encouraged the rest of the family to come. My maternal grandmother, Emilia Risi, after whom I'm named, arrived with several members of her family, including her parents, in 1911 at the age of 24. She was one of 13 children, all of whom came to South Africa. She was a dressmaker, trading as Madame Risi's. My maternal grandfather, Ernesto Risi, also from Fisciano, fought in World War I in Italy on the side of the Allies, for which he was later awarded the Order of Vittorio Veneto. Here you see my grandparents. After the war, in which he lost an eye, and we assume that he was probably suffering from post-traumatic stress, which of course was never treated. He came to South Africa in 1922 to marry my grandmother, by arrangement, we believe. He was 29. She was 35 and a widow. He was a confectioner, and part of the deal in the marriage was that my grandfather would do all the cooking, which he faithfully did. They had 2 children. My mother, Angelina Risi, born in 1923, she's pictured on the right, and her brother, Liberatore Risi, in the middle. The taller child, he was born 2 years later. The taller child is my Auntie Rita from my grandmother's first marriage. By 1925, there were approximately 2,000 Italians were recorded to be living in the then 4 provinces of South Africa. My mother was a devout Catholic, went to a convent school and played the piano. After the war, Nonno Ernesto came to identify with Mussolini, and as children, my mom and her brother participated in the activities of the fascist youth movement allied to Opera Nazionale Balilla. After struggling to make ends meet in the early years of their marriage, my grandparents made some money and were in a position to help their children to start businesses. Now, the next wave of Italians in South Africa is to do with the Italian prisoners of war. During the course of World War II, the Allied forces captured hundreds of thousands of Italian prisoners, mostly in North Africa. Prisoner of war camps were required to house these prisoners until the end of the war. About 100,000 prisoners were sent all the way to South Africa. I mean, it's so interesting that so many were sent to South Africa, and it really was to do with the relationship between our Prime Minister at the time, Jan Smuts, and Winston Churchill, who were very close, and obviously, a part of the Allied forces. And Smuts wanted to impress Churchill and give him convince him of South Africa's support for the Allies and against fascism, although there were quite strong fascist movements inside South Africa. And so he accepted 100,000 prisoners. They were mostly housed in the Zonderwater camp near to Pretoria. Italian prisoners started arriving in 1941 and the last were repatriated in 1947. This is an early picture of the camp in Pretoria, and I don't know if you can see the Saluto Romana signs being made on the right here by prisoners. The prevalence and support for fascism in the camps was a big problem for the South African government. And they were, on the whole, the camps were generally well run and offered educational and cultural activities and medical care. This is a beautiful photograph. It's a book cover of a book on Italian prisoners of war, showing some sort of respite from the harshness of camp life. However, the experience was traumatic for all prisoners, and many tried to escape. Some of the prisoners joined work parties that built major roads, bridges, and buildings, and some were sent to work on farms and foundries. The South African government, interestingly, only allowed prisoners to join these work parties if they signed a cooperation agreement which discouraged them from spreading fascism among the South African population. A number of roads and mountain passes were built by the Italian prisoners of war, and their contribution is recorded in various places in South Africa. For example, the Detroit Cliffs Pass near Cape Town has a commemorative plaque recording the names of all the prisoners who lent their skills and labor to this major construction. This is a painting of my mother at 21, which was done by a prisoner of war. And the inscription on the back of it is very moving. The prisoner of war's name was Francesco Fodarzo, and it was done in Zonderwater prison in 1944. And he says, even if my poor brush wasn't able to capture the delicate colors and the harmonic lines of your face, please accept this as an indelible memory which I offer you as a pledge of my infinite affection. I don't know how, under what circumstances they met. I'm sure she didn't sit for him. Maybe he painted from a photo. Maybe, he was doing this to make money. We have no idea. After the war, 870 prisoners chose to remain in South Africa. And according to various accounts, in the late 1940s, thousands of former prisoners chose to return to South Africa as immigrants, growing the ranks of the Italian community in South Africa. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were about 70,000 Italian living in South Africa. So this was the inscription on the back of the painting. The world changes dramatically in 1948 in South Africa. A mere 3 years after the end of World War II, after the defeat of Hitler, after the defeat of Mussolini, after the defeat of fascism, incredibly, apartheid is formally introduced in South Africa in 1948. The National Party that came to power had openly supported European fascists. 148 apartheid laws are passed, regulating every aspect of life on the basis of race, from where you could live to where you could work, from which bus you could catch to which public toilet you could use, from where you could go to school to who you could love. Every aspect of life was regulated on the basis of race. South Africa became a land of signs. Millions of black South Africans were forcibly removed from living areas that were designated white, and all protest was brutally suppressed. Interestingly, and I suppose unsurprisingly, in apartheid South Africa, Italians were considered white and enjoyed the rights and privileges of the white community, although there was a period during which we were referred to in a derogatory way as WAPs, derived from guapo, and meaning a type of flashy, boisterous, swaggering, dandy-like man, which also came to stand for working on pavements, based on the stereotype that Italian men typically did manual labor, such as road building at the time. As time went by, Italians living in South Africa became more prosperous. My mother met my father, Emilia Potenza, in South Africa in 1955 at the whites-only Italian club in Johannesburg. In response to a street poster advertising jobs on the gold mines in South Africa, my father had left southern Italy, San Michele de Serino, in the province of Avellino, as there were no jobs after the war. His parental grandparents, Maria and Antonio, whom I sadly never met, were supporters of the Partito Comunista Italiano. As a result, the family faced discrimination, especially from the local priest, a supporter of the ruling Democrazia Cristiana, who blocked applications by my father and his younger brother Pietro to work in different sections of the police force. Domenico was one of 5 children. His older sister Guerina also left Italy at more or less the same time for Argentina. Together with several age mates, Domenico came on a dodgy plane with a broken propeller via Entebbe, Uganda, to Johannesburg. His brother, my uncle Pietro, left a few years later, left San Michele for Genova, and here we see his wedding photograph where he marries Carmelina, his childhood sweetheart, in 1959, and my cousin Luisa was born in 1960. Luisa is with us today, she said. My dad worked on Randfontein gold mine in Johannesburg as an unskilled miner, going underground every day, doing one of the most dangerous occupations on earth. He married my mom in July 1956, very much without the blessing of her family, probably because of the class difference between them. When I saw Gone with the Wind for the first time, I realized why my mother had married my father. He was a charming Clark Gable lookalike, and in many respects, un guapo. My older sister, Maria Luisa, was born in 1957 in Johannesburg. The young family then moved to the Orange Free State, one of the 4 provinces that made up the Union of South Africa, the heart of the goldfields. I was born in the small mining town of Virginia in 1959, and my brother Antonio Roberto, whom we called Robbie, followed soon after in 1960. Sadly, we only spoke English at home, although, both my parents spoke Italian. Ostensibly because my father was trying to learn English, for work. My parents spoke Italian to each other when they were fighting, and they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. So Italian became the language of conflict. Around about this time, my father and my mother approached my nonna Emilia and nonno Ernesto, for a loan to buy a retail grocery business. My grandparents refused to offer help, as they believed that my father was a no-gooder. As far as they could tell, Domenico was a womanizer and a gambler, and they didn't trust that their investment would be in good hands. We moved to a bigger adjacent mining town of Welkom in 1965. And in 1968, my youngest sister, Rita Marina, was born. This is all white Welkom. I'll talk about that a bit more. As far back as I can remember, my mother took us to church, the local Catholic church, every Sunday. My father never accompanied us. Although we were unable to afford private schooling, the Catholic Church did not want to lose Catholics to government schools, so my siblings and I were offered bursaries. The girls went to the convent of St. Agnes in Welkom, and my brother to the next door Christian Brothers College, also a Catholic school. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Italianità in Welkom, in the Orange Free State in South Africa. As good Catholics, we made our first Holy Communions, went to confession, and regularly were confirmed. Went to confession regularly and were confirmed. Besides our Catholicism, our Italianità in our lives was expressed in the following ways. We went to picnics at the Vaal River, which was halfway between Johannesburg, where my cousins, my mother's brother and family lived, and Welkom, where we lived. With my maternal grandparents, my uncle Liberatore, my mother's brother and my auntie Angelina, and my cousins Ernesto, Liliana, and Emilia, number 2, my cousin who was also named Emilia. And these picnics always included a fare of mortadella, mozzarella, salami, and we just loved it. Nonna and nonno, my parents, my uncle and aunt, all spoke Italian. At home, we usually ate pasta fazool, as we called it, pasta fagioli on a Friday night. Neapolitan words that were part of our everyday lexicon and still are were scoregge, pabosh, migil, mamon, chaquad, schifet, petzend. I don't know if these mean anything to you. We played scoppa. There was an Italian club in Welkom, and we used to go there for Italian food, and my father played bocce and soccer at the club. The 1960s and the early 1970s were boom years for the mining industry and for the South African economy as a whole. The gold price was very high, wages for black workers were very low and contributed to the high profits and the higher wages for white workers. Trade unions for black workers were banned. Most whites experienced relative economic prosperity and either actively supported apartheid or simply buried their heads in the sand. Because there were 13 gold mines in and around Welkom requiring huge numbers of migrant workers, there were effectively 10 blacks to every one white living in Welkom. Except you didn't see these black workers because they were migrant workers all housed in mines in single-sex compounds. Just about the only black person we ever interacted with as children was our housekeeper. And yes, even though we were a lower middle-class family at best, we could afford a housekeeper. My mother expressed her Catholicism through a commitment to justice and fairness and a humanism of sorts within the context of apartheid South Africa. My father, on the other hand, over time abandoned his communist roots, actively supported the apartheid government, and became a racist. Common to many white immigrants in South Africa was the idea that you don't bite the hand that feeds you. Very few Italian South Africans were active in the anti-apartheid struggle. I have a vivid memory of my father coming home in tears on the 6th of September 1966, the day our Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, was assassinated by a parliamentary messenger. Verwoerd was widely considered to be the architect of apartheid. I was 7 years old. Just over 2 years later, my mother discovered that my father had another family and that we had a half-sister who was 2 years older than my younger sister, Rita. This led to my parents being legally separated in 1969, and my dad left. I went on to complete my high school years at the convent of St. Agnes, during which time I dated young white men, some of whom were conscripted into the army of the apartheid state. Then our worlds changed fundamentally. The Soweto uprising of 1976 came during my final year of high school and rocked my protected world of relative white privilege. High school students in Soweto, the large black township adjacent to Johannesburg, protested mostly peacefully against inferior education and living conditions. Police opened fire and hundreds of school children were killed. This is probably the most iconic photograph of the anti-apartheid struggle. One of the first people to die in the conflict was the person being carried here, Hector Peterson, and this is almost the La Pieta of the South African struggle. This represented a turning point in the struggle against apartheid. Black youth were taking center stage, and with far greater militancy than their parents' generation had. Many went into exile and swelled the ranks of the banned liberation movements, especially the African National Congress. Internal mass resistance would be a feature of the 1980s, though it would take another decade to bring down the apartheid state. It was in 1977 that I left home to attend university in Johannesburg. At the University of the Witwatersrand, I joined the Catholic Society on campus, a radical student organization strongly influenced by the liberation theology of Latin America. This led to living simply, espousing socialism and my activism in student organizations, and then in teacher and civic organizations affiliated to the mass democratic movement that swept the country in the 1980s. I include, that's me, in a teacher's capacity. I include this next photo of my cousin Liliana, who is with us at the back, being arrested at the University of the Witwatersrand in 1985. She was imprisoned for a week without trial for intervening when police were beating up a black student on campus. But more about Liliana later. Extraordinary photograph. My father did not communicate directly with his family in Italy for 25 years. News of my father only came from those who had left Italy with him and had come back to visit. Then at the beginning of 1980, my uncle Pietro and my cousin Luisa tracked my father down through a telephone directory at the South African embassy in Genova. They felt that it was important that Domenico should come to Italy to see his parents before they died. And so they made the trip to Johannesburg to see him, and I met my uncle Pietro and my cousin Louisa for the first time in February 1980. I had just turned 21. It was a wonderful experience for all of us, particularly because we had so much in common politically, not so much Domenico anymore, even though we had lived in such different contexts, and we were family. 1980 was a tumultuous year in our lives. In July 1980, my mom died of breast cancer. She had never been to Italy. Robbie, my brother, 19 and at medical school, and I, 21, completing my teaching degree, became the custodians of my younger sister, Rita, who was 10 years old at the time. We continued to receive alimony from my father because Rita was a minor. The three of us lived together in a block of flats in central Johannesburg called Pontebello. 1980 was a tumultuous year for my family in Italy. These photographs were taken 5 years later. The area in which San Michele is situated in the province of Avellino was hit by an earthquake in 1980, in which nearly 3,000 people died. Thousands were injured, and 300,000 people were left homeless, including my nonna Maria and my nonno Antonio. They went to live with nonno Antonio's brother, Zio Orazio. Nonno Antonio sadly, Nonna Maria died 4 months later, only 4 months later, in March 1981 at 78, just a few days before Domenico, my father, managed to get back to Italy for the first time. So he never saw his mother again. And Nonno Antonio, whom he did see, we see a photograph of my father with his father there in 1981, also died in Genova a few months later in 1981 at the age of 80. My older sister Louisa and my brother Robbie followed similar political paths to mine, as did my cousin Liliana. My sister Louisa's pictured over there, and my brother and my cousin Liliana, who's here. While I continued to be active in the mass democratic movement inside the country, my sister Louisa, my brother and Lily were recruited into the then banned African National Congress, operating underground. They were involved in feeding the ANC's liberation ideology into church organizations, civic organizations, and so on inside the country. And then in the mid-1980s, Louisa and Robbie joined the military wing of the ANC, and Lily underwent military training, making ours, I think, probably the most radical Italian family in South Africa. They were lucky never to have been caught, unlike some of our comrades, as they were involved in criminal activity punishable by long and brutal prison sentences. I'm going to skip. Voting for the first time, visited Italy for the first time. Unlike my mom, who was never able to make the trip to Italy, during 1984-85, I spent several months in Italy, here in Genova, with my family and learned some Italian. And I couldn't wait to get back to South Africa and speak Italian to my dad for the first time. But on my return, he absolutely refused to speak Italian to me. In the 1980s, international pressure to end apartheid escalated. Pressure was exerted, among other things, through various economic and cultural sanctions and embargoes against South Africa. Italy participated with partial withdrawal of Italian investments from the country until the first democratic election in 1994. In 1989, one of my brother's patients, Helen Joseph, pictured here, a veteran anti-apartheid activist and comrade and close friend of Nelson Mandela, applied for the 23rd time to visit Mandela in prison and was granted permission to do so. As she was infirm, she was allowed to take 2 people with her to make the trip from Johannesburg to Cape Town. She chose to take her nurse, Sina, and her doctor, my brother. My brother had the privilege of spending 3 hours with Nelson Mandela at Victor Verster Prison in Cape Town in December 1989, 2 months before he was released. Over lunch, Nelson Mandela shared his vision for a negotiated settlement to end apartheid, and with his long-term comrade, Helen, and her 2 helpers. The release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and the first democratic elections to be held in South Africa in 1994 are often considered synonymous. But in fact, between 1990, after Mandela's release, and 1994, we experienced a period of civil war. More people died in political violence from 1990 to 1994 than from 1948 to 1990. On the 27th of April, 20 million people, black and white, stood together in long queues, waiting patiently in the hot sun to cast their vote for freedom. It was a joyous day filled with hope and optimism as South Africans embraced a new future. In 1995, I joined the ANC choir on the insistence of my brother Robbie and my younger sister Rita, who were both members. There I met Lael, the woman who unexpectedly was to become my wife. Lael and I were able to be legally married in the new South Africa and went on to adopt 2 children, Noluvo and Tembela. My dad died of silicosis in 2003, pictured here with Mari and his 3rd wife and one of her grandchildren. Silicosis is a lung disease from working underground in the mines. However, when we adopted Noluvo, he was rather less able to accept the fact that he had a black granddaughter. We only adopted Tembela after his death, so he never knew her. In 2021, both Noluvo and Emilia Potenza became Italian citizens. In the 1990s, I was involved in rewriting the history curriculum for South African schools and developing some of the first post-apartheid history textbooks. I'm currently the curator of the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, one of the most visited museums in the country, where I have worked since it opened in 2001. The Apartheid Museum tells the story of the struggle to overcome dispossession, institutionalized racism, and state violence. It is the story of overcoming South Africa's form of fascism, just as Europeans overcame fascism in Europe 50 years earlier. A luta continua. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. So if the speakers would like to come up, this is a good time for questions. And thank you so much for that incredible story through generations and complex family stories, which is really fascinating too. Thank you.
Emotional after all of that, but I'll try to manage. So my question really is for Kimberly, and Kimberly, your presentation was incredibly emotional, so I would try to sort of bring it into some kind of how it made sense to me, but I know you've written on the ability of words to change states, and I'm interested in your experience of learning Italian in later life, as I have, and I'm curious about how it changes states, or how it changes one's mind to learn another language. And perhaps also you mentioned the importance of prepositions. And it was interesting to me to discover, of course, prepositions don't map. The Italian prepositions are not the same as English prepositions. So perhaps that small example, how does that change the way you use words and experience with your states?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was very struck by what you said about your father not refusing to speak Italian, and then the language of, certain languages were and weren't used. My father would be the same sort of generationally as you, and he said that they would speak the various dialects when they were angry with each other, which is why he only could catch certain words. So I think, the emotional state of language and the ways in which we use different registers of language in any language, affects how we feel. And so, as a poet, I obviously hope that's true, because I spend a lot of time working with words. But it's been a fascinating experience to be in, because I've gone to Volterra and I've now bought a house in Volterra because that's what I was told I had to do, very emphatically by the folks there, even though no one is alive there, and I do have living family in Castellana. But it has been, I can only describe it as something that has literally changed how I feel physically. And one of my slides has an article about the effect of that neurologically, the effect of learning other languages or translation. It hasn't been properly studied, but scientifically. But I, anecdotally speaking, it actually changes how I physically feel. It overrides some pain that I have. It allows me to move more easily, and I suppose the struggle to express oneself. And I always say, do I now sound like I'm 4 years old or 8 years old? And then some people will be like, you're about 12. So I think it's also the kind of vulnerability. And because I work with words, I'm in an English department, I talk all the time. I think putting yourself in that position also, it creates a kind of radical empathy that I find, I think is part of the pain override, which is what I was trying to say about wounds, is something to do with, if we go there, it's something that we share. It's not something to retreat from. And I guess, I was talking to Alessio this morning. I think the thing that probably when we're teaching language at universities or wherever we might teach, I think the most important thing for me is, like, have you had an experience in that language? I remember the first time I learned the word buio. I can remember where I was. I can remember that experience. And I think that is what, makes us human, as it were. And so for me, that's the kind of state. But also, obviously, what your presentation is literally words changing states. The power of people coming together to challenge and to contest the words of the law, the words of the things that people invent to sort of oppress folks. I think there's that angle as well. I was very interested in that journey, so thank you very much.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it's one thing that I can note from everybody from the diaspora. In my family, my grandparents also spoke Italian amongst themselves and to us sometimes, but they refused to let us speak Italian to them. And we were refused the Italian language. And that is something that it's always been a question mark for us, because I can't refute my Italianness, but I was Portuguese washed. And then when my mom married my father, she thought that her surname was, her father's family was unlucky, she didn't want to give it. So I don't have my Italian surname, I have my father's name, which is Portuguese. And I always felt that it's so strange, because I can't put the language that defines most of how I feel as a Brazilian. I was not raised within the Portuguese family, I was raised within the Italian family. And I feel very connected to Italy. I can't put it in words because I don't speak Italian, even though I understand it. So I find it very interesting how this denial of the Italian language to the diaspora, what it did to us, but then also it doesn't take the Italianness out of you, and how it affects identities, and how do we reclaim that language in a way. It's an interesting question for the diaspora. And for also, I think, I'm not sure how Italians in Italy understand how much the language has been denied to diasporic Italians elsewhere. So it's also an interesting.
Uso del tu se non ti... No, era un commento ma è anche una domanda. Io non sono un sociolinguista, ma una dei miei colleghi che è citato nella presentazione, Francesco Goglia, ha lavorato molto sulla domanda, e tantissimi sociolinguisti hanno lavorato proprio sulla domanda che ti fai. Io ne so qualcosa di secondo grado, non faccio ricerca su questo, ma ho letto varie cose, soprattutto sul Regno Unito. Però ci sono delle dinamiche sociali legate ai repertori linguistici, questo è il concetto tecnico che usano, linguistic repertoire. E ci sono due cose, la cosa di cui hai fatto esperienza, credo che loro la spiegherebbero in due modi. Il primo è, le lingue sono sempre rapporti fra persone, e sono rapporti di potere. Le lingue romanze in tantissimi paesi con più potere, soprattutto poi all'epoca nel Novecento, dove l'Italia era un paese ancora abbastanza povero, soprattutto la migrazione all'epoca è una migrazione tendenzialmente povera, non ha valore simbolico, non porta, è il rovescio che succede alla diaspora in lingua inglese. È la storia di Leonarduzzi. Leonarduzzi è cresciuta in Italia, la mamma era inglese, lei è bilingue, perché era molto chiaro il valore politico, economico e culturale dell'inglese. L'hanno mandata a una scuola internazionale, quindi non solo le figlie dei Leonarduzzi parlavano inglese a casa, ma hanno fatto scuola in inglese e in italiano. Questo in generale non è successo alle diaspore italiane, soprattutto nei paesi più potenti. Questa è la dinamica di fondo, qui ci sono dinamiche di potere dietro le lingue. La seconda cosa importante, e di nuovo è l'esperienza che fai tu, è un'esperienza vera, quello che cercavo di dire del rapporto fra le dimensioni dell'identità. Ci sono prove che dimostrano che la lingua è solo un elemento, ci sono poi altri elementi, l'identità di genere, le identità familiari, un aspetto emotivo appunto, e quindi ci sono per esempio questi studi che dimostrano che, quello che dici tu, che la perdita o l'acquisizione di lingue, soprattutto di lingue di eredità personali, è dentro una dinamica complessa, e questo si vede bene per esempio in queste diaspore complesse come nel Regno Unito, dove tanti, per esempio italo-bengalesi, perdono l'italiano, ma si sentono italiane e italiane. Io le ho incontrate, spesso me lo dicono, un'esperienza molto simile alla tua.
Posso dire una cosa? Ieri sera, tra un incontro dopo la conferenza, stavamo parlando proprio questo della lingua, e per diventare una cittadina italiana, la lingua è la cosa importante, dicono che devi sapere l'italiano, ma tante volte non capiscono la sofferenza di quello che è successo in altri paesi, che quello è stato tolto da noi.
Sì.
E sembra quasi come due colpi. Uno per togliere la lingua e poi l'altro colpo perché non hai questa lingua.
Sì.
Non è colpa nostra, è una cosa complessa. Ma la lingua adesso dicono sempre ti fa italiano, e se tu non hai questo senti vuoto. È una cosa molto complicata, dico.
I mean, I have a very funny example. It's not funny, but it's my name is Campanello, but it should be Campanella. But because Giulio decided, let's go with Campanello. But I did not know that until I was here, and somebody said, "Ah, ma che peccato." You know, so then I get this idea of, well, we're all bells ringing. Why did he allow that change? He knew what it meant. And I can see in his documents when he kind of consents to this. So my thought was, well, he wants to be the one who allows people in the threshold as opposed to the bell ringing out. But I mean, you then have to go profoundly into kind of metaphor to kind of navigate that. But I went my whole life not knowing that I was a doorbell. You know, which is significant, isn't it? I mean, we were saying those dialect words, and they were saying, if that means anything to you, because you don't know, do you?
Just a very tiny point, but I can say from my own experience that this establishing the requirement to learn the language for citizenship is strangely ambivalent. I think it was done as a sort of act of a somewhat right-wing government to raise the threshold. But actually I was surprised to discover when I took the test that the level you are required to reach is quite low. It's B1. It's not a demanding level. And I was also saying earlier on, I had the curious experience of going to a giuramento at the Consolato in London and seeing an Italo-Bengali, I think, effectively failing to do the giuramento in Italian and also failing to translate it into English, and yet being allowed citizenship by the sindaco, who was, wagging her finger and telling her off, but actually signed the papers. So there's a sort of curious ambivalence, possibly I thought some kind of a sympathy to those people who've not actually had the opportunity to learn the language, despite this government behind trying to push up the threshold. I had a sense that people in the Consolato were not wishing to exclude anybody.
So I'll just check on the time for us. Oh, just over 11 o'clock. So I just to take this opportunity to thank all the speakers who are amazing today. I think it's a wonderful way to finish this part of the conference talking about family, language, traditions, and bringing that all together, which is such an important part of the diaspora story. So thank you so much to all of you today. Thanks.